Okay. Richard Dawkins, great to meet you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you very much.
Last March, at a public debate in London, UK, involving Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, and others, the motion under discussion was, we'd be better off without religion. Now, after the debate was finished, Dawkins and his fellow atheists persuaded 45% of those initially undecided to join their ranks. Religion's supporters only managed to get 14% of the undecideds to acknowledge the value of religion. So, our web question tonight for you is the same one as the one that was asked in London. Would we be better off without religion? We're not American Idol here. We don't expect 145 million of you to go vote, but if some of you want to, we'd be delighted to hear your answers. Go to tvo.org, follow the links to the agenda, and cast your vote. Now, here to affirm the value of religion, Jordan Peterson, clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. Nadat Sonich, spiritual counselor from the Manresa Jesuit Renewal Center. And Imam Shabir Ali from the Islamic Information Center. And this being Thursday, of course, it's your agenda, and we'd like to involve you in the program, so email your questions to us at theagenda@tvo.org, and we'll get as many to our guests as possible. Welcome, everybody. I noticed you all furiously scribbling notes while Richard Dawkins was talking, so before we get to my prepared questions, I suspect I should let you all get what you need to get off your chest right now. Imam, go.
Well, I think one most important point I'd like to make tonight is that what he said to you about the basis of moral values for atheists is actually very different from what he's explained in his book. To you, he's given you social reasons. We come to what we understand to be morally justifiable principles due to the collective sort of agreement that fluctuates and evolves over time by our collective experience. But in his book, he's actually given biological explanations. He said basically that we are receptacles for the genes that we carry, and that's the whole purpose for our existence. Our genes are basically keeping us alive so that they can pass themselves on to another generation. And that's our function. So if we feel sexual desire, that's because of the genes controlling us to do that. But he's also saying that all the moral values that we feel we have, everything we consider to be good, is because of the genes that are so controlling us to think that way. And these thoughts that we have, thinking certain things to be good, are thoughts that were beneficial for our survival at one point, but may not necessarily be so now.
You've read the book, right?
I've read the book, at least, and I've paid very careful attention to this particular chapter in which he explains the basis of moral values. So he gives examples. He tries to say that atheists have as just moral basis for their values as religious people have. And he reports on a survey that was done by a certain Mark Hauser, reported in the book. And he gives an example that, a child is drowning in a pond. You're the only one there. You can go in and save that child, but in doing so, you will ruin your pants. So 97% of people surveyed said that they would go in and save the child. 3% said they would rather save the pants. Now, he's using the 97% to say, look, we all have the same sort of values. Look, 97%, whether atheists or believers, they all have the same value. But he passes over the 3%. And the point that should be noted is that on the atheistic worldview, you have no reason to say to the 3% that you are wrong for saving your pants instead of the child. Because as much as the 97% are responding to their genes controlling them and telling them what's good and bad in that situation, the 3% are doing the same thing. Okay. They're responding to their genes, and nothing is really good or bad, only thinking makes it so. Yeah.
Nada, you wanted to say.
Well, I didn't scribble madly because I found from his book and from his talk tonight that I agree with a lot of what he says, and yet...
You're a religious person.
I'm a religious person. I believe in God. I go to church. I pray
How can you
daily.
agree with what he had to say then?
Because he's talking about a false God. He's talking always about somebody else's notion of God. And he says, I don't believe in this capricious bully. I don't believe in having religion forced down my throat. There's always this sense that this God is something out there that has no connection with anything that could be real and true for you.
But he's going by the God of the Bible. That's what he says.
That's what he says. But he's assuming that it has no relation and it is never discovered through an interaction with what you know to be true and real questions that you have. And the whole point of spiritual counseling and of development in faith is that you connect your insides, your own experience, with revelation, with tradition. And there's no sense that that happens in his world. It's something that's imposed. It falls like a rock from heaven on top of you and crushes any of that. And that kind of religion and that kind of God has to go. So I would agree with all of that. I would say there's a whole other dimension that he's missing.
Okay. Jordan Peterson.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that he criticizes the people who wrote the Old Testament for their view of God. And if you read the Old Testament, as he rightly points out, there are an endless number of absolutely atrocious things that happen in that book. But the people who were writing the Old Testament were trying to come to grips with what they saw as reality. And reality itself is a very capricious force. I mean, nature itself has a tremendously bloody aspect, and people are impelled to commit genocidal atrocities and so forth and so on. And the Old Testament writers and the people who edited the books were not trying to whitewash that. I mean, the God they worshipped, at least the external part of the God they worshipped, was something of a force of nature. And nature has this capricious aspect of horror. And it was, in fact, their impulsion towards the truth that demanded that they represent the relationship with the world in that way. And somebody who's so concerned about the accuracy of observation should really be tipping his hat to people who had enough courage to portray the force of nature, which every human being has to deal with in such an accurate and unvarnished manner. So I don't think you can really have it both ways.
Let me, your question prompts a follow-up for me, which is, can you have God without religion?
It's hard. And now it's popular, spirituality without religion. And you can have spirituality without the religion you started with. Having it without community, without tradition, without anyone to help you, guide you, or support you is extremely difficult.
Dangerous, too.
Dangerous. It's the possibility of self-delusion, the possibility of despair, all of these things. And a great part of what religion involves is one of the dimensions of the God relationship. A God that you worship privately without any connection to other people, without any commandment to love, without any sense of justice, is that, that purely vertical piety, which some forms of Catholicism, some forms of religion are like that, are a distortion. If you have a spiritual sense, then it must extend to other people in the world, and you must be engaged, and it's impossible to do that on your own.
Jordan, if you have a spiritual sense, is it because you have a religious gene?